Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Logger Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Logger Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Logger Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome back to another new episode of The Logger Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Karbach Brewing, their beer developed in collaboration with your Houston Rockets. I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, a contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of the team. Joined again by Paulo Alves, our co-host and producer out of Portugal. You can follow him on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA, me on there at Ben Dubose, and Karbach on there at Karbach Brewing. So as we chat this Tuesday, February 25th, apologies for not having an episode last week, by the way, coming out of the All-Star break, there wasn't a ton of news, no lineup clarification just yet because Fred VanVleet had not returned from his ankle injury. We're hopeful that will change perhaps as soon as tonight, if not certainly within the next few days, it looks like. So we decided to push it to this break between the back-to-back coming out of the break on Friday and Saturday against the Minnesota Timberwolves and Utah Jazz, and another back-to-back tonight and Wednesday against the Milwaukee Bucks and San Antonio Spurs. Fortunately, both of these are in Houston, where the Rockets are 18-9 this season, as opposed to the last back-to-back, one in Houston against the Timberwolves and the second in Utah. Rockets just 17-12 on the road now, have not won a road game in the entire month of February, and unfortunately, they lost on night two of a back-to-back. That's becoming a recurring theme since we last recorded a couple of weeks ago. The same thing held in the earlier back-to-back. It's a weird stretch of the schedule where the Rockets have three consecutive sets of back-to-backs. Before the break, Phoenix and Golden State won on the front end, lost on the back end to the Warriors without Tari Eason. Same thing coming out of the break, beat the Minnesota Timberwolves, lost to the Utah Jazz, again without Tari Eason, and it looks like that will be the plan again, playing Tari on the front end of the back-to-back against the Bucks tonight, and perhaps holding him out against the Spurs on Wednesday night. That's the way the Rockets have played it to this point. They did get a couple of important wins with Tari against the Suns, against the Timberwolves, that could be very big in the playoff race, the draft lottery race, in the case of the Phoenix Suns, who may not make the playoffs, and the Rockets have that pick swap right. But the bottom line, the Rockets have certainly stabilized since that 6-game losing streak earlier in the month. They're now 3-2 in their last 5 games, but they have yet to go on the sustained winning streak that we would like to see to secure their top 6 seed in the West and avoid the play-in tournament and get directly to the playoffs. That's the goal for this team. We've outlined it plenty of times in the past. The Rockets aren't in a bad spot as of our recording time. They're 35-22 in a virtual tie with the Lakers for the number 4 seed in the West. They do have some separation, 2-3 games over the teams right behind them in the standings, the Clippers, the Timberwolves, the Mavericks, but it's not an overwhelming edge just yet. Hopefully the Rockets are able to stack some wins and restore that to 4 or 5 games by the time the schedule starts to be more difficult again in the final month of the year. That's what we'll see over the next couple of weeks. Rockets have a ton of home games coming up where, again, they've been very good. One other silver lining I'll mention off the top, the 3 teams the Rockets are chasing or tied with, the Nuggets, the Lakers, the Grizzlies, they all have schedules amongst the 5 most difficult in the NBA over the remaining 6 weeks or so of the season. Rockets just 18th last I checked, one of the easy remaining schedules in the West. So there are opportunities for the Rockets to make up some ground in the weeks ahead, to get some separation from teams in the play-in range, and perhaps get back to a spot where they have home court advantage in at least one round of the Western Conference playoffs. That's the hope. But at some point, we can't just talk about these potential avenues of improvement. They've got to go out there and do it. And hopefully with Fred VanVleet on the verge of finally returning from his ankle strain, Houston's offense is absolutely cratered without Fred. This can be the time to do it. We've said for a while that they need to. It feels like the last couple of weeks they've stabilized, winning 3 times in their last 5. But can they actually stack a winning streak, stack wins together, and make up for those 6 games they lost earlier in the month? hopefully that starts tonight against the Milwaukee Bucks. Paolo, I'll bring you in here. When we're looking at what's holding the Rockets back, I know against the Utah Jazz, it was the defensive end of the court. They gave up 124 points, got cooked by Keontae George. Rockets are a dreadful 5-8 on the second end of back-to-backs this season. Not having Tari Eason certainly doesn't help. They also got crushed on the glass against the Jazz. But you can also point to the offensive end of the court where without Fred VanVleet, they've really struggled all month long. Just what are your 30,000-foot views of where the Rockets are coming out of the All-Star break and what is holding them back, at least to this point, from being able to stack a few wins together and finally get some separation from those teams in the play-in range?
I think there's a few storylines that you can keep track of that kind of explain this. But first of all, I wanted to, start off with it's a little bit gimmicky, but I wanted to just show this doesn't mean anything. But typically, or people say that you see if a team's a contender or not if they get to 40 wins before they get to 20 losses. And I think if you look at our record at the time of the start of the losing streak, the 6-game losing streak, we were 32-14, if I'm not mistaken. And at that point, if you ask anybody, I think pretty much everybody would tell you, hey, they're probably going to get to 40 wins before they get to 20 losses.
3-8 in their next 11 games.
Yep, and now that's up. That's just not going to happen anymore. And not that it means anything, but it goes to show what the outlook was back then and what the outlook is now, where people are starting to talk about, or Bill Simmons was talking about, are we going to drop, or we would be his pick to drop out of the top 6 into the play-in. And so just to kind of situate everything and see where we're at versus where we were. And I think from a consistency standpoint, which is what you were talking about, it's the defense. And it's, for a while, we've talked about it. It has been declining for a while. The rebounding has been declining for a while. And even for a decent chunk of that time, it overlapped with the boost from a man starting. It overlapped with the boost from Jalen Green going off during that, elongated stretch of like 2 or 3 months. But now, that gets kind of worn off and the defense hasn't picked back up. And we thought that Jabari Smith Jr. Coming back was going to be a big deal, was going to be a big way of improving that. And against the Timberwolves, you could definitely tell the difference between having Jabari in the rotation and not. But then against the Jazz, Jabari just had a terrible game, so you didn't see that impact anymore. Maybe Dylan Brooks was already dealing with the illness that he's now questionable with for next game, and it was just kind of like a compilation of everything that has been going wrong, and it was just pretty much a game to forget. But it does help accentuate a point, which is, moving forward, I don't think this is going to keep happening. I think team's going to pick it back up now that they're healthy. I think, I'll be honest with you, I only watched highlights of the Jazz game and clips I saw on Twitter. I was not, watching that game live. But
Ime Udoka said it post-game, since you didn't see it, what basically happened, Keontae George, no one could stay in front of him. He drove at will all night. He hit threes. And if he did miss a shot, especially in the second half, Lauri Markkanen or Walker Kessler, someone like that, had an easy putback because they weren't boxing out and they lost the rebounding battle by 17. Ime, after the game, called it embarrassing, and he's right. It was just a terrible effort. I hope the second game of the back-to-back, no Tari Eason, Jabari Smith still getting his legs under him after missing 6 weeks with the broken hand, Dylan with the illness perhaps. I hope those are reasons why. But yeah, it was ugly. They didn't stop Keontae George at all. And on the rare occasions that they didn't get a rebound.
Yeah, but this to say, even with that sum up, I think from what I saw against the Timberwolves, it felt like Jalen Green had a little bit of more of a pep in his step. He seemed rejuvenated compared to how he was looking pre-All-Star break. I thought Alperen Sengun did so as well. I think he was moving better. I think out of the post he was a lot smoother. And so I don't know what happened from that transition from the one game to the next. But I saw some stuff that I thought was worth being happy about. And then, as you're saying, even if you just look at the box score, the Rockets shot better from the free throw line, they shot better from 3, they shot better from 2, they had less turnovers. And then there was a 17 rebound differential. And you just cannot win if the opposite team has 17 more possessions. You just can't win. Let's say it's the other team's getting 1 point per possession on average, which is, fairly good for the league, but it's nothing outstanding. Or you'd be heading into the game with the 17-point handicap. If the other team was getting point 0.5 points per possession, and on offensive rebounds, it's typically better than that because putbacks count as well, and that inflates your points per possession number. But let's say they got half a point per possession, which would be awful. It would be like, I don't know, Carousel Vert when he's having a bad game level of bad. You would still be going into the game with a 8.5 point handicap just off of those rebounds. And let's be just honest with ourselves. The Rockets throughout the entire season have not been a team that pulls teams out. And if they're going to give up 8.5 points per game on the very, very, very low end, they're not going to win many games. And the other things that I think it's worth pointing out is I think the Rockets have one win this season when their opposition scored more than 120 points. And it has happened twice since the losing streak began. The Timberwolves scored 127 on us when Ant went off in the fourth quarter. Not this last game, the one before. And the Jazz scored 124 points on us last game, and we obviously lost. This is not a team that can win by outscoring their opponents. This is a team that has to lean on the defensive side of the ball to win. And no matter when we saw against the Jazz, the big three didn't have games that were that bad, and we still lost because that's just not how we win games. Our offense is never potent enough. We don't shoot enough threes. We grind games out, and you're just not going to score. You're just not going to score enough for that whole hub. All in all, it just has to be the defense has to pick back up. Hopefully, it's a scheme thing, and now that we're getting out the pieces back and it all fits back together, but it also has to be about the rebounding, and that's effort. That leads me to something that can be worrisome on the long run, which is Ime Udoka is a head coach that you bring in for the culture, for the effort, for the defensive identity. He's not a good offensive coach whatsoever. His most creative plays going down the stretch of games is finding a way to get the most we can get out of it is we get the guy we want the ball in an ISO, and that's mostly how we try to close games out when we call timeout. There's no fancy, movement. There's no fancy trying to get, cheap, really inventive plays. That's not how we win. We post up, we crash the boards, we ISO a lot, and we run some inverted pick and roll, which is kind of creative, but not really anymore. And so if Ime Udoka is the head coach of this team, we need to have an edge on other teams defensively in effort-wise on the rebounding because of the culture. If we don't have that, then we'll have to start having conversations about, is Ime Udoka the best fit for this team? If he's not getting the players to buy in anymore, and this is way too early to have this conversation. I'm just saying if this doesn't get better moving forward, or the other way you can do it is you can change the team and you say, hey, these players aren't buying in anymore, but we still believe in the coach. We'll get other guys in, we'll reset the culture a bit and hope that gets better.
Which I think is far more likely. But it is worth noting, by the way, that even with this downturn since the calendar turned to 2025, they're still number 1 in the NBA in rebounding, and they're still number 4 in defensive rating. Now, to your point, since the calendar turned to 2025, the last 25 games or so, they've been a middle-of-the-pack defensive team in terms of defensive rating, and the injuries have been correlated with that, at least to some extent. Fred VanVleet, Jabari Smith missing extended time, Tari Eason missing a good chunk of games in there as well, with the ongoing issues related to his lower leg. Also more back-to-backs in the schedule, which I think was certainly at least somewhat of a factor on Saturday. Rockets getting into Utah about 4 a.m. So if they didn't have their legs, I think that's at least part of the explanation there. And then the rebounding, they haven't been bad, but they've been good rather than great during that same time frame, especially on the defensive glass. That's where in the period without Jabari, they really suffered. They were still a good offensive rebounding team with Amin Thompson and Tari Eason, but not nearly as good on the defensive glass. And so we can throw out all these excuses, and the reality is they were so good for the first 35 games or so of the year that even with this downturn, they're still near the top of the NBA in defense and rebounding for the season as a whole. So I think that combined with the injuries and the tough schedule offers hope that this is going to resolve itself in the next couple of weeks, especially with a lighter portion of the schedule in terms of difficulty coming up. But at some point, they've actually got to do it, right? I think that's your point, is
Yeah.
that since the calendar flipped to 2025, they haven't done it. We're now almost to March. We will be to March by the end of this week. And so we can throw out all these caveats. We can throw out all these excuses and say, hey, it hasn't been easy. And it hasn't been. But at some point, they've got to actually turn it around. And this is the time that it needs to happen.
Yes, and we see it with good teams all the time, right? We know that before the season begins, there's those teams that are getting older and that sometimes fall off. There's the young up and coming teams that people take bets on, and then there's the bona fide contenders that we know eventually are going to be good. And what happens with those teams is that, yes, throughout the season, it can become a slog. These teams will have rough stretches. When it comes to the All-Star break and afterwards, those teams pick it back up and we start seeing which teams can make a run in the playoffs because teams start to take the games more seriously. They pick up form, and that's how you want to head into the postseason. And if the Rockets want to be one of those teams for the first time this year and heading into years further, it doesn't matter that the way you won games up to this point was from sheer effort, and it doesn't matter that that does wear on players' bodies. What matters is now it's time to go out and play your best basketball and put all of the effort in. There's no excuse anymore. There's no let's wait for the All-Star break. This is the time where you have to buy in if you want to be anything in the playoffs. And so it's just, it strikes me as an effort thing. And it strikes me as some jadedness because, guys are getting blown by that typically don't get blown by. If there's one thing that, for example, Jalen Green can do on defense is stay in front of guys, and he's been getting blown by. Tyrese and the same thing. He's one of the most switchable wings I've ever seen, and he is really good at staying in front of guys. Sometimes he gets beat and he recovers. That's not saying that doesn't happen, but he's getting beat on drives as well. And he's been a step slow turning his body. There's been a lot of that going on. And even a man who's the best defender on the team, and I think the best player over the past few, even over this rough stretch, even him, we see him take plays off and we see him give up buckets that we typically earlier in the season wouldn't, right? And luckily, I think that's something that if everybody puts their mind to it, it's easy to fix because they feed off each other, right? And if someone's energy is not there, every other players will start taking possessions off as well. But if everybody buys into it together, I think it's realistic to expect it to get back to at least 80 or 90% of what it was earlier in the season. I don't think it's lost. I think it's a lost cause at all. Hopefully this isn't quoted in 2 months as it being a dumb take. I'm not worried about falling out of the top 6. I think we have a good enough cushion. I don't trust any of the teams that are down there, but I do think that if you want to go into the playoffs with any semblance of optimism, this is the time you pick it up, and I think they will. And my take about Ime Udoka and changing the coach or changing the team, that's going to be a problem if we get to it in a couple of months when the season ends. I don't think that that's what's going to happen. I'm just saying that's what's on the line right now.
Yeah, and to your point on this being the time, our friend Karthik Prasad, Stanford KP on Twitter/X, pointed out the difficulty of the schedule to close the year. You have a stretch with 2 road games against the Lakers, also road games against the Warriors and the Clippers, and a finale against the Nuggets, all in your final 7 games. Now, it's possible that if some of these teams have clinched their playoff seed, that maybe they're resting some guys down the stretch of the year. We can hope for that, although I'm not sure how likely that is in a crowded West. But the point is, on paper, while not murderer's row, that's a consistent stretch of really good teams. Oh, and you have a home game against Oklahoma City in there. So the only for sure win that you have in your final 7 is against the Utah Jazz, or should be. It's in Houston, but the Rockets did just lose to the Jazz in Utah a couple of nights ago, so I don't think you could even take that for granted at this point. So I bring all that up to say the Rockets have an opportunity in the here and now over the next 3 to 4 weeks. Not every game is going to be easy, but you should be able to stack some wins and build a little bit of a buffer, get back to closer to 20 games over 500 As you mentioned, their high water mark was 18 over when they were 32-14. Now they've slid back to 35-22. They've sort of been alternating wins and losses for the last couple of weeks. And so if you want to build back that buffer to the 15 to 20 above 500 range, which would put you back in the ballpark of, if you're 18 over 500, you finish at 50-32. And so I think if you're at 50 wins, I think symbolically that's a big round number for this team that would represent a ton of progress. And also, I don't really see a world where 50 wins does not have you in the top 6 of the West. So it would mean that you avoid the play-in tournament as well. And so this is the stretch of the schedule that you need to start building back that margin, to your point, and what Stanford KP was saying on Twitter, because down the home stretch of the year, the schedule does get more difficult. Now, I want to transition our discussion to the back-to-backs, because I think that's at least part of what's been going on over the last month or so, combination of the injuries and a portion of the schedule which has been very difficult logistically on this team, even if they were at full health, which they certainly have not been. Perhaps this back-to-back, both at home, they'll have Fred VanVleet back, and that'll help their offensive organization, limiting turnovers a ton. I do like what we've seen from Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun since the All-Star break. To your point, I think both are moving a lot better. Sengun had the back issues prior to the break. Jalen had the knee contusion. I think both on the offensive end of the court were moving much more freely against the Timberwolves and the Jazz. By the way, that Minnesota win gives the Rockets a tie in the season series. So if the Timberwolves do make a run, I think, well, certainly it's a 2-game difference in the standings that you won that game, but also tying them, it gives you a chance to potentially win the tiebreaker. And so that's a big deal for down the road as well. By the way, in the aftermath of that game, I saw a stat that the Rockets lead the NBA in clutch wins, which is sort of funny when we critique the offense and their half-court execution all the time. But the real reason for that is that the Rockets play so many clutch games, period. To another one of your points, if the Rockets are struggling to blow teams out and every game is close, then a lot of your wins are going to be considered clutch by the definition, even if you're not necessarily executing down the stretch of those games. You're just having to hold on because you built up a larger lead earlier. And I think that plays into that stat a little bit. But regardless, there's reasons for optimism. And now that the back-to-backs are close to over, this is your third to last, these 2 games against the Spurs and the Bucks this week. Hopefully the Rockets are going to have a much healthier team and a much more rested team down the stretch of this year. And that bodes well for the playoffs, because there aren't any back-to-backs in the playoffs. And if you look at the Rockets splits by rest, so they're 5-8 when having no rest. That's the second night of back-to-backs. But they are 17-12 on 1 day of rest. And they are 13-2 when having 2 days of rest or more, which they will have tonight against the Bucks. And especially in the first round of the playoffs, you'll have at least 2 or 3 of those games based on how the schedule is spaced out when you have 8 different playoff series taking place at once. And the NBA wants to maximize TV exposure for all of these teams. And one of our recurring debates on this pod, we've talked about in the past with regards to the playoffs and the Rockets' so-called try-hard advantage. That's what it's been referred to on social media. We've talked about it at times in terms of the formula for this team, defense and rebounding, not just on the defensive end, but crashing the offensive glass as well. And the Rockets being disproportionately worse on these back-to-backs because they don't have their usual legs. And the fear has been, what's going to happen when you get to the playoffs and other teams are much more focused and much more dialed in? Even if the Rockets aren't literally on a back-to-back themselves, will that advantage be eroded based on the fact that other teams aren't treating it as one of 82, but they're much more locked in? When you dive into the no-rest data, the second night of a back-to-back, which I wrote about at RocketsWire, you can call it up at rocketswire.usatoday.com. I published this after the Utah game, titled it By the Numbers, where the Rockets are lagging on game 2 of back-to-backs. While defense and rebounding has certainly been an issue overall since the calendar turned to 2025, for the year overall and where the Rockets are much worse on back-to-backs compared to the overall season, it's actually the offensive end of the court. Defensively, in terms of their rebounds, in terms of points allowed, they're right where they are, and in some cases even better than their season-long averages on these back-to-backs. Now, they weren't against the Jazz, but that's one game. They've had 13 second night of a back-to-backs all year. And by and large, the story has not been that the defense or the rebounding has been worse in those 13 games, was against the Jazz, but overall, no. The story has been that they have been a much less efficient team on the offensive end of the court, shooting worse, getting to the line less. They actually are making a little bit more from three-point range, but anything inside the arc when it comes to shot creation, driving, the legs just are not there. And it's especially interesting when you dive into the individual player data. So there are 7 players that I think are going to, make this team sink or swim. The 5 starters to begin the year: Fred, Jalen, Dylan, Jabari, and Shagun, and then the Terror Twins, Amen and Tari off the bench. I'm not really looking at the data for anyone in the 8th spot or lower in the rotation because, honestly, A, they're not that important, and B, they don't play enough to where you would expect fatigue to potentially be an issue. So when you look at that clear top 7, the guys who the Rockets are going to be leaning on to decide their season. So there are 2 that have not really been affected by back-to-backs in terms of their efficiency: Alperen Şengün and Amen Thompson. Now, Şengün hasn't been that efficient this season, as we've talked about, but it's not like he's getting worse on back-to-backs. He's about the same in terms of his true shooting. Amen has actually gotten better. Amen's about 60.5% true shooting overall. He's almost 64 on back-to-backs, which is, ridiculous. He's a cyborg. But beyond that, Şengün and Amen are players who generally take their shots closer to the rim. The formulas that lead to those shots for each of those players are different, but the point is, when you're shooting closer to the rim, you're not as dependent on your legs and the burst the way guys that are predominantly perimeter-oriented players do to generate their offense. And it's especially Jalen Green, Dylan Brooks, Jabari Smith Jr., and Fred VanVleet that have gotten worse in these back-to-backs, sometimes dramatically worse. Tari Eason's been a little bit worse as well, but I'm not really counting him for purposes of this analysis because at this point he doesn't seem to be playing on night 2 of a back-to-back. You could actually argue that maybe they should be playing him on night 2 of a back-to-back instead of night 1 so that you have a rested Tari as insurance for some of these other guys. But really, for purposes of this discussion, it's Jalen, it's Dylan, it's Fred, it's Jabari. These are the guys that just offensively, their production tanks on night 2 of a back-to-back. And I think that's where you can mount a case for real optimism that, hey, once you get to the playoffs, it's not so much that other teams trying harder can take away this advantage for the Rockets. No, it's more these players and their formula for success just literally cannot handle that level of workload, especially on a team that doesn't have that clear A1, as we talked about ad nauseum on this pod throughout the weeks, months, even years. And so they need a little bit of extra juice to generate offense, and these guys on back-to-backs just simply do not have it. So I find that really interesting and potentially encouraging that, assuming the defense stabilizes, when you look at where the Rockets have been worse, back-to-backs for the season as a whole is something that has held this team back. Well, the guys that are specifically holding them back when it comes to efficiency, that should not be an issue in the playoffs, and I don't think it's related to anything other teams are doing to them. I think it's just the legs are not there, and that's something that in the playoffs should be different once you have time off in between games, even if the other team is trying harder. Again, I think the bottom line, it indicates that a lot of this is within the Rockets' control. It's not something that it's going to be potentially eroded simply if the other team tries harder. No, if guys like Jalen and Fred and Dylan and Jabari have their usual legs, then they should be something closer to the versions of themselves that they are when the Rockets are 17-12 this year on games with 1 day of rest, and 13-2 dominant when they have 2 or more days of rest going in. So that's the case for optimism I've got. I'm curious your thoughts on that, Paolo, and I'm also curious your take on a couple of implications from this discussion. And at this point, there's only 3 back-to-backs left, 2 after the next 2 days. So perhaps it's too late to really change. But going forward, I do wonder if it makes more sense to play Tari Eason on night 2 rather than night 1 of the back-to-backs, because Tari is useful insurance. He's a very useful hedge if someone like Jalen or Dylan is having a bad night. And Dylan on Saturday, maybe it was the illness, but he was just dreadful in Utah. Tari can be a really useful insurance policy. You didn't have it. When you look at the data and you see specifically who is worse on these back-to-backs, maybe you should be holding Tari. Again, not that many more opportunities to do that for the rest of this season, but maybe you keep that in mind for the future. If you have to limit Tari on back-to-backs next year, I hope that's not the case, but just something to sort of keep in the back of your mind. And in a season where every game may count in the standings, it's tightly packed in the West, who knows? Maybe you do need to look for every margin advantage you can over these final couple of back-to-backs as the season winds down. That's one ripple effect from this data that I think perhaps the Rockets should consider. The other ripple effect, does this not make the case to potentially, once you're back at full strength, play Dillon Brooks off the bench? If his performance is strongly correlated with having or not having legs, and beyond just the offensive downturn on back-to-backs, I think we've seen the last 2 years, he started off very strong on defense, and then it slipped as the years progressed, and he's nowhere near as good at denying dribble penetration. We saw it at times against Keontae George on Saturday when he would draw that assignment. Does it not make the case for Dillon to potentially be the guy that comes off the bench? And I think it was Adam Spillane of Sports Radio 610 that said, just give Dillon 25 minutes and 6 fouls and turn him loose. Because when Fred comes back, and I don't know if they'll immediately make the long-term lineup decision with regards to, Amin has been starting in place of Jabari because Jabari is still working his way back conditioning-wise from that 6-week absence. So it may not be a day one decision that as soon as Fred comes back, Ime Udoka announces what his lineup is going to be for the rest of this season and the playoffs. They may give it a little more runway and allow Fred and Jabari and these guys that have been out to get their legs under him. Perhaps Tari can come all the way back to where he doesn't have back-to-back limitations and so on and so forth. But ultimately, by the time the playoffs start in April, the Rockets are going to have to decide on a starting lineup, and we know how they started the year, but Amen Thompson has come on strong, and I don't think, for reasons I've articulated on this pod many times in the past, that Amen Thompson is going to come out of that starting lineup. He is a guy that is clearly in Ime Udoka's circle of trust. When Ime did the widespread benchings, that Warriors game before the All-Star break, when no one had their legs, Dillon was benched, Jalen was benched, Şengün was benched, Amen was not. Even though Amen offensively wasn't really doing much that night, he is still that trusted on the defensive end. He is someone that Ime wants out there for maximum minutes, and if you're not starting a guy and you're artificially capping his minutes at 30 or so for reasons we've explained in the past, it's tough to exceed 30 minutes if you're coming off the bench. I don't think Amen is coming out of that starting lineup. And so then you have two guys, Dillon Brooks and Jabari Smith Jr., for the other forward spot. And so there's cases for both. With Dillon, he's a little more flexible. Shooting-wise, he's 39% on threes for the year. Jabari about 35%. So you can argue that Dillon gives you a little more agility, better floor spacing, although perhaps Dillon is due to fall back a little bit on those. With Jabari, it's the additional size, it's the defense, the rebounding, the numbers that have cratered during his absence over the 6 weeks or so that he was out. You can make cases both ways. But if you look at the data and you see that, hey, Dillon is worse on back-to-backs, probably because he doesn't have his legs, and just the eye test, we can look at this team play and say Dillon Brooks is a worse player as seasons progress, and that's probably correlated with his legs, but it's not like he's not trying. Dillon is as dialed in as there is in the NBA. He's the ultimate competitor. The more plausible explanation is that he just doesn't have the juice that he does when he's at his best. Does that not make the case for Dillon being a 25 minutes per game 6-man, whereas Adam Spillane said you give him 25 minutes, 6 fouls, and turn him loose, as opposed to asking him to sort of manage his body over 30, 35 minutes per night? And if that's the case, then your starting lineup would be Fred, Jalen, Amen, Jabari, and Şengün. So I know I threw a lot at you there, Paolo, but the two things that I really want to get your take on would be, A, Tari and the back-to-backs. Should they be considering playing him on night 2 rather than night 1 if he's limited? And then the lineup implications. Does this data and the eye test with Dillon's defense not suggest that Dillon may be the guy that should and will go to the bench once this team gets to full strength and has to make its decision on who's actually going to start for this team?
Yeah, I got you. I think. Well, there's one quick thing I wanted to point out on the thing about the back to backs and the stats that you pulled up. I think they're really interesting. I think it shows how much of an edge physically a man has over not only his own team but everybody else in the league. Because a lot of the times, or at least few enough times that I remember, it's a trend in this season. When we've played back to backs on the second half of the back to back, the other team was also playing the second half of a back to back. So it also is a statement to, or a testament to, how much better man is physically compared to other teams, the opposing teams as well. So I just wanted to point that out and add that I see your argument about the shooting, and I think that this game against the Jazz is probably just an outlier. How many games are you going to lose the rebounding battle by 17?
Right.
But we shot 39% from three, man. Like, we're not supposed to lose those games. Yeah,
It's a bad
it's an
loss.
outlier. Yeah, it's an outlier, I know, but I just wanted to point that out. And then regarding Tari Eason and the back to backs, personally, currently, I think the chip needs to flip, or the switch needs to flip with this team, right? And for the switch to flip, you got to go all in with the coaching as well. And so you got to say, hey, I think with Tari it should be matchup dependent. We'll play Tari against the better team, and we'll risk losing back to back, but we'll give ourselves the best chance to go on a run and beat both teams. Now we have the Spurs and the Bucks. I would play Tari against the Bucks. That's the first half of the back to back. That's who I play them, because that's the team I'm most scared of, especially because Damian Lillard just ownless for some reason. And so I'll play him there. I'm not sure what the other back to backs are. I think we only have a couple more.
Thunder
Um,
Pacers is one
so
that's next week.
I'll play Tari against the Thunder, and the Pacers are on a streak. They're on a roll. They're a pretty dangerous team right now.
And
But
to your point, by the way, Ime Udoka seems to share your view. It's just, to this point, it's actually cost them some games. Tari didn't play against the Nets. They lost that game. He didn't play against the Jazz. They lost that game. I guess you could argue that having Tari against the Timberwolves played a role in them getting, a fairly close win that they probably needed in the standings the night before. So I guess you can argue that, but it feels like they've let some games slip away that Tari has been out. I guess to your point, though, it's sort of like they have no business losing those games, even if Tari isn't available. It sounds like that's what you're saying.
yeah, and it's about the message that you send. You play your best players, and you get your best lineup possible against the best team if you have to make the choice. And I think that sends a different message to the team. And I'm willing to take that gamble because I think something drastic needs to change with the team and the attitude. And I don't think, listen, I think this team needs to go on a run, and they need to get, those 18 games at the very least over 500. And to get to the 50 wins to be, just someone who can call a contender, not a tier one, but you can call them a contender. And to me, that's what you're aiming for. And if you don't get to that, it doesn't matter if you get 47 wins or if you get 43. And so I'd rather try and go all in and see, hey, listen, I think for this team, from a morale standpoint, they need that type of run. And the difference between going 500 the rest of the way and going 3 games over 500 the rest of the way is not that big of a deal. And I'd rather swing for the higher variance. So that's my take. I'll play it matchup dependent, and I'll risk it more. Risk it by playing, instead of locking in a win by playing him against the worst team, I'll play him against the better team. And also because you wanna use those teams as a measuring stick. The Nuggets now are not what the Nuggets were beginning of the season, and we haven't played them in a while. You want to see how you stack up against teams like that. But yeah, the Thunder as well, same thing. So Chet's back now. You want to see how do you do against the Thunder with Chet. Moving on to your second kind of point, which was about the rotation. I'm actually, just for the people out there, if they followed me long enough, me and Adam Spillane don't have the best relationship. We had, some episodes of
Right.
Twitter beef, but I think that's a really interesting take. The play him 25 minutes and let him just go ham and foul and not be worried about fouling out. Because if you play 25 minutes, you can have 3 fouls in the first half and not be bad.
Right.
Um, and if he falls out, then he falls out. Everybody's healthy now. You can afford that. Jason Tate has been serviceable. You can afford that. So I do like bringing him off the bench, but I'll double down on the hot takey side of it, which is I'd start Tari instead of Jabari for a while just to see how it goes. for reference, since Tari came back from injury, he's actually shooting 41% from three. And you can say that that's arbitrary, but the injury was a pretty long stretch where he didn't play, was what about 10, 15 games? And so he's hot enough from three that you should try and see what you can get from that. And that allows you to kind of still have the Terror Twins effect
Yeah.
while starting a Amen Thompson.
Yeah, that's interesting. You would preserve that. And one other thing, I'm sure some will say, well, if you bring Dylan off the bench, part of the motivation is that you're sort of capping his minutes. Well, can Tari handle the higher minutes? Actually, he can. They're not playing him on back-to-backs, but when he does play, in 3 of his last 5 games, he's played at least 30 minutes, and 2 of them he's played 34 minutes. So I know they're keeping a close eye on him on the second night and, again, not letting him do back-to-backs. But when he does play, he doesn't seem to have any limitations. They're letting him go 30, 35 minutes. So there could be a pathway there, and they did open the door to that by starting Tari ahead of Jabari in the game against the Timberwolves when Jabari came back.
Yeah, exactly. That taboo is gone, so that you don't even have to worry about that anymore. And it does open up the possibility of, or the possibility is still open if you just start Dylan and a man and you bench Tari and Jabari, I guess. But it opens you to the possibility of playing Jabari as the backup 5 and playing small ball for prolonged stretches of the game and seeing how that fits into not just as a death lineup, but how that fits into a team that, if Jabari and if you have a man and Tari as a third twins in the starting lineup and giving you that energy there, you're gonna need some help off the bench, and perhaps you can, get some of that back by playing Jabari at the 5 and just being a switch everything, defense and trying to turn that into extra offense, and you can try and run some fun stuff which we don't at all, which is you can try some pick and pop with Jalen and Jabari. You can try some pick and pop, which we really just can't run pick and pop at all because it's either Sengun or Steven Adams, and so that's basically an entire an entire part of the playbook that we just can't run. And so I think it's something that we should try. It kind of conflicts with my previous take that we should go all in and try to get as many wins as we possibly can. And typically you do that by not changing that much. But I'm really intrigued, and I think those could be, cool weapons for you to deploy in the playoffs, depending on the team that you're facing. If you're facing a smaller team, I think that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, there's the other argument against it, which would be, well, we just saw how much of a difference Tari not being there makes for the rebounding, or Jabari not being there makes for the rebounding, and now you're still not going to have him there for as many minutes as you possibly could. But you're still going to have him out there, right? It's going to be a little bit less, but you're still going to have him out there. I think the gain of having the chemistry between Tari and the men outweighs what that would be. And, if it doesn't work, you'll go back to what you had before. But I think it's something worth trying.
Yeah, and it's not that much of a risk because there isn't a status quo with all the injuries. It's been so long since they've been at full health that it's not really the risk that it would normally be when they're just playing game after game, week after week with the same lineup, the same rotations. They've been so disjointed for the last 6 to 8 weeks with all the injuries and all the ripple effects from them that, yeah, if you wanted to try something different, this would be the time to do that because it's not like you're really disrupting some sort of strong chemistry. All right, last segment before we wrap up the pod, and we'll try and make this a little bit quicker because there's much less to discuss on the court with this guy, and that's Reed Shepherd. There's been a lot of Reed talk on social media over the All-Star break because, his performances in the Rising Stars games were very similar to what we've seen at the NBA level. Not only did he not make shots, he didn't take a lot of shots. He's been timid, he's been indecisive, really other than the 3 games at the G League level when he clearly had a green light and performed very well. It's been fairly consistent in that not only is he not making a lot of threes, he just doesn't seem to have the confidence to take many of them, period. And this is a guy who was billed as a generational shooter. And so you combine that with the guy picked right after him in the draft, Stephon Castle by the San Antonio Spurs, having some really good games, playing the same position. There's some talk, some fear that, hey, what if the Rockets missed? What if Reed is a bust? Now, I'm not going there. The sample is way too small. This is a 20-year-old who was a sixth man on a good but not great Kentucky team this time a year ago, a 3 or 4-star recruit out of high school. So this idea that he's supposed to be ready year one in the NBA, and if not, we need to panic, he's not the guy, I think that's silly. There's no reason to feel dramatically different about Reed's long-term potential right now than you did prior to this season. Any of those takes are reactionary. I don't care how bad the numbers are, especially when you see what he was able to do at the G League level. When he did have the green light, he had a longer leash. There's something there. I'm not going to predict that he's going to realize all of that potential, but what I will say is that I don't think the potential is different now relative to 5-6 months ago before this season started. If you liked Reed in August and September, you should like him now. You shouldn't feel that differently about Reed as a prospect, even though it's been a bad year one. And even though he's been outplayed by Stephon Castle, it's way too premature to say that Castle would have been the better pick. So I will push back on that. However, the angle that I am concerned about, and this is where I want to bring you in, Paolo, what does the roadmap look like moving forward? Not just this season, but next year as well, assuming Reed is on the roster, for figuring out when Reed is actually ready to do more at the NBA level. Because, he gets a few opportunities, but number one, he hasn't taken advantage of them. And secondly, this whole notion of him being too tentative, it's tough to really fix that if he's going to play, 5 minutes in just the first half on night two of a back-to-back because the Rockets are down a few bodies. If the runway is that limited, it's hard to expect his approach to be dramatically different, in my opinion. So even if he does play, and I'm sure he will at times, and also mop up duty in any blowouts and so on and so forth, I don't think it's reasonable to expect. You can hope, but I don't think it's reasonable to expect anything to dramatically change over the final 6 weeks of the season with his play, especially because with the Rockets trying to lock up a playoff spot, home court advantage potentially, seeding, all those implications, Ime Udoka is going to want to lean even more on veteran players that he can trust as opposed to younger guys for developmental purposes. So at this point, I think Reed is what he is, and any growth is going to occur in the offseason, training camp, and probably leading into next year. I don't think this is a situation like Clint Capella 10 years ago where he suddenly catches fire in the last 10 games and all of a sudden is playing rotation minutes in the playoffs. I would love to be surprised on that. My personal opinion is that ship has largely sailed when it comes to this season. However, moving forward, the question that I have, how will the Rockets know that he's ready? Because, another reason for optimism with Reed, we have seen prospects these last few years. Look at Jalen and Jabari. They weren't good their rookie year, just like Reed isn't good now. And they have steadily improved as they have gotten more opportunities. The thing is, those were tanking years. So they were going to get opportunities no matter what. And the Rockets got to see that they were making progress. And so Steven Silas and then Ime Udoka were able to gradually give them more responsibilities and trust them more. Last year, Amen Thompson is an outlier. Amen Thompson came in when the switch had been flipped to trying to win, but Amen was just way more advanced defensively than almost anyone else in the Rockets' core seven. I guess Tari Eason was good as a rookie, so this comp doesn't really apply here. We're talking about guys who weren't good as a rookie, but you want to, and you trust will get better, get to that good level as the years progress. So Amen was able to earn playing time immediately because unlike most other young guys, he was already that advanced defensively. And Cam Whitmore, he didn't play in the first half of his rookie year, but in the second half, you had the injuries to Tari Eason and then Alperen Şengün, and you simply needed someone of that size and finishing ability that could put the ball in the bucket. He had an athletic profile that team a year ago needed, and Ime Udoka had no choice but to sink or swim with him, and fortunately they were able to swim. The question with Reed, because especially if he's not making his threes, it's not like he has some defining physical characteristic that clearly makes him better than anyone that is currently playing. How will the Rockets know when he is ready to play more minutes, to get an opportunity to develop, if he's not out there playing? I don't think it's as simple as put him in the G League because he's already played well in the G League. We've already seen that. I mean, you can do that just to keep him from getting too rusty. But if he goes down and plays well at the G League, I don't think anyone's going to say, wow, Reed Shepard is ready. No, the same questions will be there of, well, Reed played well in the G League before, but is it going to translate to the NBA level this time? So my question for you, Paolo, it's not so much how do you feel about Reed Shepard, the prospect, because I like him. I don't need that question answered. I still think he's going to be a good NBA player for the same reasons we liked him in the pre-draft process and after the Rockets drafted him last June. My question for you is, how will the Rockets know this year or in future years, and how should they know that he's ready for more responsibilities? Because this is new ground. Again, this is not the tanking years where guys were going to be out there regardless, and you'll know simply based on their production whether they are developing and ready to take on more responsibilities. This is not a Ben Thompson or Cam Whitmore where either they're clearly ready or there's a clear deficiency. There's a fine line to walk here if the Rockets don't trade him. I know they could trade him, but that's a hypothetical. We're talking about the world where he stays on the roster. How do you think they can and will determine if he's ready for more minutes? That's my question for you, Paolo.
So, first of all, I wanted to touch on. I know this wasn't the question, but I did want to touch on his performance thus far.
Okay.
Because I think it's relevant. I think because of the type of prospect that he is, a lot of what he does and doesn't do well boils down to is the ball going in from three. That's the entire premise of drafting him. It's, okay, can this guy be a Fred VanVleet replacement? Just the guy that's, when teams are working with Tolper and Shingun, that's going to just punish them, right? And so if he is shooting 40% from three, considering he shot, I think, 44 or 45% in college, nobody's saying a thing. Everything's on track. So that's just the biggest variance about it. But I will also say that it does worry me how he looks on defense. And he's looked better at times, he's looked worse at times, but to me, it sometimes strikes me as he is struggling because he doesn't have the tools. And he's 20, and he can still get better at that. And we know he's athletic. We'll see how that develops, right? And sometimes, I think as
he's got the right mentor in Fred VanVleet for that body type, by the way.
Exactly. And I think something that I've learned as I've watched more and more basketball is that athletic tools are a little bit overrated when it comes to playing defense. If the mindset's that if you're defending the right way, if you're stepping in and keeping the right distance between you and your matchup, and you don't leave your feet and you anticipate what the other person is doing, a lot of defense is just mental and communication. And so even if he's not going to be a lockdown guy, or even if, listen, look at Aaron Holiday, right? Aaron Holiday is passable on defense, and it's mostly IQ. Doesn't have the size, doesn't really have the quickness, but he works, right? And if you asked anybody about Aaron Holiday before he came to the Rockets, everybody would have said, oh, that tiny little guard that played for the Pacers for a while and then played for the Hawks and was basically out of the league. You wouldn't expect Aaron Holiday to be trusted the way he is by Ime Udoka. And sometimes it's misplaced, but a lot of the times it's not. And he's been a part of runs. Game against the Warriors was offensive, but sometimes defensively as well, he's been handy. This to say that I'm worried about the defensive side of it, but not too worried. What I'm mostly worried about going forward is one of the reasons I advocated for trading for Fox that early was because I could kind of see it coming, and maybe I was being too pessimistic. Well, apparently I wasn't. That Reed was going to struggle, and if he didn't hit the ground running, it was going to be tough for him to come back and play significant minutes. And so to me, it made sense to cash in on what was a lot of draft hype, a lot of people saying he was the best guy in draft because of Summer League, because of everything like that. It made sense to perhaps trade him for a really high return because even though he's a young guy, it's going to take a while before the Rockets get value back for him if the plan is to play him. If the plan is to get that value back on the court with him playing as a Rocket, it's going to take 2 to 3 years at the very least. And if they want to wait for that, that's cool. But if you want to wait for that, you can't overreact during those 2 years because that's the timeline you're set for, right? Now, if you want to get that return, that value return earlier, you're going to have to do it by trading him, and perhaps you should have done that already. And so I think now they're committed to him overcoming those issues on the court and eventually paying back the Rockets for their faith and their draft pick via on-court production, and then afterwards, if you want to trade him, you can trade him. But now that we're at this point, you can't be overreacting up until probably he gets to the beginning of his third year, and you see, okay, at this point, how are you doing? He will be 22 years old. How's the progress going? Because you're right, there's not many ways in which he can play if he's not confident shooting the three. That's the biggest thing, or at the very least, if he's not making them. Which is why I think you should just send him to the T League. And a lot of people say, oh well, we did that already, and he was too good to play there. Listen, he had 2 really good games, but that was it. He played 2 games. Anybody can have 2 games. And I think he is too good for the G League, but that's better than rotting on the bench and playing spot minutes here and there. And so you can continue to develop him that way. And, it might look like a demotion at first, but for his day-to-day progression and for his day-to-day life, he'll just be playing for a different team. Right? He's not going to be reminded every day, oh, I was demoted. No, eventually he'll settle in. He'll get used to playing on that on the Vipers, and it will be, hey, this year's for development. And it won't be the constant daily worry of, oh, I'm not playing. Oh, listen, especially so because we know that even though we're a young team, you don't get to practice much during the regular season. There's games every other day. Um, you know, there's shoot around, but there's really not that much real practice in between games because the season is so long and because games are happening so often. And so because of that, I think the best decision would be to send him to the G League. I think next season you give him a 15-game buffer to see how he looks. He probably won't be ready, and you send him to the G League and you give him a full season there. And if if he has a 20-game stretch where he's just unguardable there, and there's really, really, really nothing you can take from it, then you bring him back and give him another chance. But what I would urge people to see is that at this point, his value is probably decreased enough that there's no real point in trading him. You'll get pennies on the dollar, not worth it. Might as well bet on the talent.
Well, if you had the perspective of trade value, you're probably better off expanding the G League sample because whatever chance you have of him being a trade asset, you probably need to be able to make the case that, hey, he was just artificially capped at the NBA level by having a really good team, and it just wasn't realistic to get him minutes. And if he goes down to the G League and consistently plays well, then it's easier to at least make that argument, as opposed to right now, if he's not playing at the NBA level and the G League sample, while good, it's like 3 games, the sample just isn't there. Not saying that it'd be a slam dunk argument if you expand the sample to 10, 15, 20 games, but it's at least easier to make than the one that they would have to make right now when the sample is 3, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is a completely different debate, and I won't get into it, but it's actually one of the main reasons why I think it would make sense to have loans in the NBA like they do here with football, European football.
Now that's an off-season discussion.
Yeah, there's teams out there that would probably play Reed Shepard real minutes, and the Rockets wouldn't mind sending him there, right? It's better than the G League. And if not, within the NBA, loan him overseas, different type of competition. You know, a lot tougher than the G League, but that's bogus for right now.
Rockets would loan him to the Jazz, and then he would cook the Rockets in a loss, which I know happens in European football all the time, where guys that you've loaned... Well, no, European football, that you can't play against the team that loans you, right?
Yeah, you can play
Yeah, yeah.
That's a clause you can have, right? You can make it so you can, but nowadays nobody lets you.
Dude, I want to revisit this in the offseason. The concept of a loan system for young NBA prospects on good teams who were blocked. I'm fascinated by that. We won't get into it today, but dude, I like this. Let's revisit this during the dead period of August and September.
Yeah, but it's definitely a good debate. But now, getting back to what I was saying, it really is just about that. If you're not gonna at this point, unless there's a team irrationally still high on him, then you could explore that trade in the offseason. You see, hey, listen, if it's a team that's starting over, right, that's going to give him a lot of chances. Listen, if the Suns want to trade Booker and KD and just bottom out, and they don't have a point guard prospect, and they're probably not going to take one with their own pick at 12, and reach Shepard excites you, and they value him over, I don't know, a couple of late firsts or whatever, or a couple of firsts from the Rockets' future. At that point, if he's really valued, then you consider it. But I don't think that's the case, and because that's not the case, the way you're going to extract value from him is going to be on the court by developing him, because he's still a really good talent. It's just that he's probably underrated by the market right now. And so you play that game, but doing that and saying that you don't want to trade our young players also means that you have no choice but to be patient with them and don't call them busts or a full season into their careers, right? Reed hasn't gotten the chances. I'm not making excuses, but unless you're actively advocating for trading him, calling him a bust doesn't do him any good, doesn't do the Rockets any good, doesn't help with his development. If you're a Rockets fan, one of two things: you either want to trade him now and get whatever you can for him, or you have to support him as a player and hope for the good of the team that he develops. And being toxic towards him, calling him a bust, I know people say players don't check social media. Sometimes they do.
You're not
Having
helping.
that,
That's the bottom line.
yeah, you're not. If you're a fan of the team, you're not helping. And there's no problem with calling a spade if that's what you believe, but don't be overwhelming, posting that everywhere, because that's not going to do it any good.
Agree. And especially because the guy that he's getting compared to, Stephon Castle, it's a total apples to oranges scenario because the Spurs aren't really trying to win, and especially not now that Wemby's been shut down. So it's full apples to oranges, a guy that's getting a long leash and every opportunity versus a situation like Houston where every game is precious and Ime Udoka is looking for every margin that he can get.
Yeah, and listen, I this is the one that triggers me a little bit. Gasol has had some good games, especially a recent stretch of good games, but he's back to what he was. And for the season, he is a 13, 2, and 3 player with a
His true shooting percentage is 50.6.
yeah, he's a 50% true shooting player. He's shooting 28% from three, 41% from the field, 73 from the line, and he has an okay assist to turnover ratio for a point guard. This to say that, that's a typical bad player on a bad team that gets a long runway type of stat line. It's
And now people are
the
hyping him up because of the dunk contest. Yeah.
yeah, the volume numbers are the stats in volume are okay. It's the 13, 3 and 3 season. The efficiency numbers will god awful for the season. And so, listen, listen. Reads don't look any better, but I think they're not that much different from each other. One just gets a lot more of the spotlight because he gets to play more.
Exactly. And of course, we'll see Castle when the Spurs play at Toyota Center Wednesday night.
Yeah, and I'll just say, listen, if Reed Shepard right now had 54 games under his belt, playing 25 minutes a game, I guarantee you he'd have a 35-point game where it was just lights out from three, or a stretch of games when he was like that, and his season efficiency numbers will probably still suck, but he'd have that stretch that would hold on to. The difference is we didn't get that chance, so you didn't get to roll that dice.
Yeah, agree. All right, well, we'll bring the episode to a close here. I just wanted to do a Reed segment because it feels like he's been more of a point of discussion recently because of the All-Star break, because of the Rising Stars, because of Stephon Castle getting some shine coming off the dunk contest and getting those counting stats on a bad Spurs team. It feels like that discussion is picking up a little bit, especially because we're at a point in the season now where if it hasn't happened at this point, I don't think it is this season in terms of Reed being a good rotation player for this team. That ship has sailed. You're going to be talking about next year or the year after that if we're talking about actually keeping him in Houston and realizing his value. And so it feels like whatever chance there was of him making a clear step this year, it needed to happen by, it's hard to say an exact date, but I'll say the All-Star break at the latest. And so with it not having happened as the calendar turns to March, I think the reasonable expectation at this point is that it's not going to happen this year. And so this is sort of a read in review, if you will, just sort of reviewing his rookie season, what we've learned, what we haven't learned. Hopefully we'll get a larger sample in the G League, and what we saw in that limited sample of 3 games earlier this year will continue to be the case. But, when the year eventually ends for the Rockets, hopefully after a playoff run, we'll do, year-end reviews of what we learned about various players on this team. With Reed, we're just sort of doing that now because it feels like, in my opinion, we've reached a point where he is what he is right now. And we're just going to have to pick up that discussion in the off season and in the years ahead, should they keep him, with regards to when and if he is ready to take that next step. Anyway, that's where we will wrap for today's episode. And I promise in the weeks to come, we'll talk much more about the players who actually are deciding whether the Rockets do go on a playoff run or not. Just want to do this Reed one right now, coming out of the All-Star break, and we'll turn our attention to the true rotation players, what Ime Udoka decides for his starting lineup once everyone is back healthy. We'll pick that up as the 2024-25 season winds down. For now, this is where we'll break, and if you want more content before our next episodes, the best place to get it is online. You can follow me on Twitter or X at BenJubose, Paolo at Paolo Alves NBA, and the show at The Logger Line, where if you go to The Logger Line's page, you can find our link tree. That's got links to our distribution partners like Apple, Google, and Spotify. If you'd be kind enough to subscribe and leave a positive review at your location of choice, we greatly appreciate that. Also, on the same link tree, you can find links to friends, sponsors, partners of the program, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790. Hit up those links, and you can enjoy their content as well. So, with those plugs complete, we'll adjourn for today. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line. Go Rockets.